So this is in regards to the milk banks and the question and even the fatwa that was circulating around in regards to a final fatwa that had approved the permissibility of using that milk for the NICU babies or even for other infants, for Muslim infants, of course. So there are three differences of opinions in that regards. The first opinion, which was embraced by the Committee of al-Fiqh al-Islami in Jeddah, and they regarded that it is not permissible simply because we're not capable of tracing back the origin of that milk, and of course therefore the implications of trying to differentiate between the kinship of the family or even the kinship of those that would be using that milk is not something that we are capable of tracing, and therefore that might result in having kinships confused. And what we mean by kinships, in other words, a possible thing where siblings or milk siblings might actually get married to each other in the future. And since we're not capable of tracing that, then they regarded that saddan lidhara'a, which means closing the means to the evil or anything that might trace to even put us in doubt, that we're supposed to be avoiding it in general. And of course, when we're looking at that opinion, it always regarded that we're supposed to be considering the probability that there is a high probability that the children might actually consume the same milk from the same mom, and since we're not able to trace it, that might result into kinship marriages or sibling marriages or even relatives. And the second opinion had regarded that it is permissible to use such banks, whether donating the milk or even consuming the milk for the children. And the first evidence that they had considered, although I find it really absurd, but in the end I think it's fair to mention it, they regarded that if the milk is separate from the mother, that the milk in itself is not enough to consider the kinship or the, let's call it the relationship between the child and the woman, because they regarded that to make that relationship, it's more than just the milk in itself and on its own. And they regarded that the relationship that results from suckling the milk, which is, let's call it a bodily, an affection, an emotional relationship, they regarded that is that makes the combination. So it's the milk and also the personal relationship that actually makes the kinship foundation, and that it is the basis of why there would be a relationship, and whether it's brotherly or sisterly or even a mother and child. And the evidence that they actually used is that they used the ayah, said وَأُمَّهَاتُكُمُ الَّتِي أَرْضَعْنَكُمْ, and the women that had, or your mothers that had nursed you. And they said the word nursed is not necessarily to mean only gave you the milk, but they said the word to nurse is to literally have the child actually suckle onto the mother's breast. And the second opinion, or the second evidence, they said يحرم من الرضاع ما يحرم من النسب, and they said based on the hadith that was narrated by Ibn Abbas, that what makes يحرم من الرضاع, what makes the relationships as haram in terms of progeny, that we would apply the same rule when it comes to nursing. And they said the word is nursing, therefore it's a literal word, and it's not enough to use the milk. Although I find it really absurd, but it's fair to actually mention the evidence, because if we were to just assume that it's a personal relationship and a combination of personal and plus the milk, then that would be absurd, because the brother didn't have a personal relationship with necessarily that boy, and we know that what makes a relationship is really the substance in it, which is what the Prophet ﷺ had actually mentioned in another hadith, that what makes basically the nursing slash the rida' and the milk is really ma fataqa al-'azma wal-lahm, what had developed the flesh and the bones. And certainly what developed the flesh and the bones is the milk, and not necessarily the affection or the emotional relationship between the mother and the child. So even if we were to have, let's say, a woman that is not producing milk have a relationship between the child, so let's just assume that there was no milk production, but the woman still actually had the child suckle on her breast, that doesn't necessarily make her become a mother or a milk mother. And that's why I find that opinion as absurd, but I think it's fair enough to actually mention it, like I had said. The fourth evidence that they had used is that they said that milk in such banks is not necessarily from one particular woman, but it's actually a mixture of a number of different women, and that it's pasteurized. And they said with the heat and with, of course, not only temperature, but also the chemicals, that it actually makes it into a different substance, and not necessarily just from a particular woman, and therefore that they consider that the probability that this person or this baby consuming that milk is from one particular mother is going to be very minimal. In other words, they considered that the probability of having one child, the chances are that the child having the milk from one particular woman is going to be a very small number, because there are so many different women that are providing and supplying such milk. So therefore, whether we're talking about the heat, the pasteurization, or whether we're speaking about the chemicals or the milk mixed with other milks, they considered that there is a very low possibility that the child is actually going to be mixing the milk with the same woman again and again. So they regarded that the chance and the implication, therefore, in the long run, that the child might actually have consumed of 5 suckles and more, according to the hadith in Sahih Muslim, from one particular woman, is going to be very rare and probably not even happening, except with probably a particular 0.0 something ratio. Now that, I must admit, they probably had a good point on that point. So it does actually, I would say, strengthen their opinion in that regards, that there's a very low chance that the child might, if we're talking about 5 suckles or 5 full feedings, that with all the women actually supplying the milk supplies, that there's a very low chance that the child is actually going to be considered as really the son of one particular woman. So that, I must admit, that particular evidence is really, I think, giving some weight and making that point kind of strong. The third opinion, they regarded that we're not necessarily talking about supplying the milk or even consuming the milk, and they regarded that to focus on consuming the milk. They regarded that, well, if the child needed it in rare situations, and that was the only best way of giving the children in the NICU or even in the hospital, that was going to be the best option. And they regarded that, well, this is a necessity, and yet they regarded that there is the wrong approach and the wrong study, that we're just focused on whether the children are allowed to use the milk, but not necessarily focused on the implications of down the road. Are we capable of putting in regulations to make sure that such banks are considering the regulations, or the Muslim regulations, so they are supporting that? Well, if we want to advocate for the Muslims and even for such consumption, that it's important that we would pressure such banks to consider the implications of using such milk, and therefore consider that, well, they can definitely put in a trace or probably labeling, and then that way the Muslim children will have their needs advocated for, and certainly giving the consideration of the Islamic rule. And that way, of course, it's all about how we would request, as of course Muslims are definitely probably the most concerned about using such milk, because of Islam encouraging the usage of nursing, and considering, of course, nursing as the best option and the best way of giving health and good diet for the children. So I think it's, that third opinion, they were focused more on, well, let's not necessarily focus on whether children should use that, but let's focus on putting in the regulations and making sure that the implications are actually considering the Muslim guidelines, which really is a strong point, to be honest, because it's important to advocate for the Muslim consumers, and certainly I am sure that they're capable of tracing and considering the consumer's choices. So if we want to advocate for using such milk supply, it's important that we would also request the regulations to be met based on Islam. So these are the three different opinions, and what do I regard? I would recommend staying away from such milk banks. But there are situations where perhaps the children might be in need of those, but it's definitely a considerable opinion in situations where children are probably pediatricians are probably recommending the usage of such milk, that we would definitely probably keep that in track and keep that in mind, and perhaps down the road, if the child wanted to get married, to probably speak to the mother and ask about whether they had used such milk, from which location, etc., and probably get more details, just to avoid any confusion in terms of what we can trace in terms of milk siblings, and therefore regarding such considerations. Because Islam is extremely strict on that, I think it's important that we would, one, advocate for Muslim rights, and we would also advocate for our children's health as well. So I hope I answered that one. Assalamu alaikum.